All right, thanks K5. Sorry about that, guys. I've been talking for 5 minutes and didn't even realize I didn't have sound going, but that's okay. So welcome to Comic Island. We're going to be talking about A Man Among Ye #1, and I will edit out the beginning part of that video. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about where I picked up this comic, because this has actually been out for a while. It's the first issue in a 4-part miniseries that came out last year. And I just sort of picked this up in the early days of the pandemic, back when you couldn't even go into shops or anything like that, and it was a very quiet, fearful time. Like, we didn't really know what the future was going to be like or what the situation was going to be. And these books were a real solace for them. But Man Among You kind of slipped through my fingers, not only in reviewing it, but even just reading it. And I just kind of happened to pick it up and check it out the other day, and it felt like a good review because I'm very tired and clearly making mistakes. So I figured it would be worth looking into this book a little bit. I always love checking out a good image #1 and critiquing whether or not it's a good introduction to the story. It's kind of a recurring thing we did. And this one's pretty solid, although I will state the story is very, very simple. We open with the character kind of on the cover here and this pirate crew along with the captain, Jack. So Anne and Jack are leading this crew and basically making this raid on a British ship. And the crew is very resentful of Anne being there. They don't like her female presence and are not a fan, to the point where they're debating mutiny. Meanwhile, a child who looks like just a little boy is just managed to survive the British ship being destroyed and burnt down and is stowed away on the ship. Now, the story does something that I see a lot in fiction, especially in westerns and stories around like the age of pirates, where this takes place at the end of that age and everything's kind of being torn down by European forces. And that's fine. It's just we see that a lot in fiction these days, and stuff like Red Dead Redemption, and even most major pirate fiction. That's like the backdrop for a lot of Pirates of the Caribbean, in spite of all that franchise's flaws. And it kind of feels like the echoes of narration in stuff like Assassin's Creed 4, which is an excellent pirate game. So, but that's fine. As we later learn, these are all real people that existed in the real world, and this story is kind of cool because it blends the reality of these characters with the fiction that the creative team behind this, writer Stephanie Phillips, Craig Cermak doing the like penciling, or actually no, he does the penciling and ink, I should say, and then Brittany Pazzillo does the coloring, and Troy Pietri does lettering. So the stowaway ends up being discovered and locked up, but some of the crew get drunk and decide to menace the boy and fight him. And luckily they're rescued by Anne, who clobbers them and knocks them down, and then reveals that it's actually a girl named Mary Reed, who is our third real character, kind of in us being told this interpretation. And a cool little 2-page essay basically kind of summarizes what I'm talking about and why I think it's interesting how it blends fact from fiction. And then there's just some bonus artwork and some really cool shots of how this book was made. It's a cool co-publication between Image Comics and Top Cow Productions, and on the whole, I think it's a really solid book. What I really like about it most, I would say, is, yeah, it's a very simple story. We've kind of seen all these elements of the story in other stuff before, like the dwindling age of an era of freedom, such as the Golden Age of Pirates or the Wild West, as in other fiction, because it's not even just Red Dead that does that kind of stuff. And we've seen things like even the plot with like a stowaway, and there's like an evil British governor ordering this guy to go find the pirates and hunt them down. The crew had some deal with him, and all of these elements we've kind of seen before. But what I really like is how it's executed, because this is an Image book, and it's an indie book, and it's a story about pirates. But where I feel a lot of other artists and just across the indie sphere kind of, in too many books I see, draw about people in a very realistic tone compared to the more cartoony looks of this book, this works for me better. A lot of more indie books tend to draw characters in a way that it kind of lands in that uncanny valley, and they look almost a little unsettling to me, or just a weird splice of like kind of what am I trying to say? Like a 2D drawing with a more realistic image in a way that like it works for conveying a realistic and expressive face, but often does kind of come across as a little off in a way that hopefully I'm describing a little bit. But I feel a lot of comics benefit more from a more cartoony look, unless you really are doing something specific with the more realistic tone, because there's a ton of exceptions to the more generalized like talk I'm making of artwork here. You want to have a more dynamic and like cartoony kind of look for the action and for everything to really kind of pop in terms of coloring. So what I mean by that, I guess, is and they don't look unrealistic or just like cartoons, but by doing that, but this book strikes a nice balance in a way that the characters are expressive, they feel very human, but they also don't register as so human that it like creeps into that uncanny valley. They're on the cartoony side of it, I would say, where they are kind of simple designs, so to speak, like in terms of the characters, and they are relatively low in terms of detail on the faces and the quality of the characters in terms of the detail on them. And I think that artwork really works in making this a fun read. And I think because of that, I would recommend the miniseries. Zach Taft was saying, is this a pirate story? And yeah, of course. And then asking if I heard about Shang-Chi. I did, and it sounds very exciting. There's a kind of cool bit where the guy who's in like some of the like teaser or trailer is in the Homecoming movie. I thought that was funny. K5 says, is Top Cow a local comic book publisher? That is correct. Or no, sorry, they're not. They're not as big as Image, but they do publish other stuff, and I've read from them before. So they're an indie comic publisher, not local to Canada or anything like that, I don't believe, unless I'm mistaken. But and this book's also like got a little bit of optimism in it. Published in the height of the pandemic, and when a lot of this stuff was uncertain, there's a little symbol here and thing about how like, yeah, this time sucks, but our comeback will be bigger than ever. It's right there actually on the cover. K5 says, he talking about the Shang-Chi trailer? That trailer did nothing for me, but I'm still going to check it out. You know, I'm just cautiously optimistic about it the same way I am about most Marvel productions. I did notice in some of the footage that the MCU has a very certain and particular look to it, and that works in kind of making this all feel like a shared universe, but it is a little strange in just how something can be totally different from a lot of the established Marvel lore and characters, and yet just still feel so much of the same of what we've kind of seen before. I will say it's got to be more dynamic and different than, like, it can't just be another superhero movie like all the other MCU ones. I think it has to do something a little bit different. Zach Taft says, so it's the same people who made Spawn? No. I don't think any of the creative team is involved in that. Stephanie Phillips has done a bunch of stuff, including for DC and Descendant, which is badass. She's done Dark Horse and stuff like that. But I don't see Spawn anywhere on here. Spawn is Todd McFarlane, of course, is the main brainchild of that. Zach Taft says, and so I agree there are ways to make a character human, case in point, Spider-Man. Well, if you look like someone such as one of the more current Spider-Man artists, Ryan Ottley, I think that's a good example of how, and most Spider-Man artists in general tend to lean in this direction of making it a little more cartoony and simple in its design, but that allows for it to stay on the safer side of the uncanny valley, where you can have expressive and even kind of detailed characters, but they're cartoony enough where it doesn't get too creepy. It's more prevalent of an effect with CGI, but I do find it happens here and there with certain indie comics and with artists kind of still developing their own form or going for too much detail, and it leads to like these facial expressions that I find a little off-putting and alien, because I think it is getting to the point where it resembles a human face, but it doesn't register as quite right to my brain. And this is all very subjective, of course. I just found this a really good example of artwork done well in the indie world, but not the only one. Like literally just within hand reach, Bitter Roots, another example of a series that actually nails exactly what I'm describing in Manamongi in pretty much the same way. It kind of gets right up to the point of getting to the level where it might be too realistic. So it's still robustly cartoony, but there's a lot of detail in the faces. And both Joey and I really like nice, hefty facial expressions in comics that really convey the emotion of moments and give things feeling. That's important for a book like this because the plot isn't terribly heavy, but the artwork and the action and the like dialogue kind of carry you along and make it an emotional experience. And that's why facial expressions are so important for so many comics, because most stories can and should lean heavily on emotion. Zach Taft says, I agree, they made John Walker's outfit look alright in Falcon and Winter Soldier. I'm not sure what you're agreeing with, but maybe just in terms of what we're talking about here. And that is actually kind of true of the MCU in general. They also kind of generally rely on simpler character designs, kind of representing base level comic book looks. And I think that's actually for the best. You don't need a really complicated Captain America suit. Something just trimmed down and simple generally works well. And when we almost inevitably see that dude in US agent form, that's probably going to look nice and clean and simple too, I would imagine or hope. So K5 says, what you said about details and feeling in art, I like Chris Samney's art. Oh, sure, and there's a ton of examples. I'm thinking of stuff like Invisible Kingdom looks really good as well. Even Clay Mann does this really well. And actually, Clay Mann might be an example of where it gets into like a much higher level of realism than the more cartoony looks we're talking about. But because so much detail and care is put into his artwork, he kind of pulls it off. There are artists who can do the high level of detail that like where you get really realistic looking faces and characters, body proportions, all that stuff, and it works well. Like I said, you just really need like creative sense to your work and stuff like that, and that's not for every artist. I don't think they should all feel obligated to do it. For one thing, it takes a long time. So if you want an ongoing series or something that you can kind of push and sell between two publishers during the middle of an economic firestorm, then that's good. If you can pull it off, then it's worth doing. And I feel they did it. They did a good job of this on the whole, in spite of some flaws here and there. It's not like my favorite indie book we reviewed ever or anything like that, but it is strong. And one thing I really like about this is it's just, hey, here's a pirate series. This isn't superhero nothing or whatever. It's just, we could use more pirate fiction out there. I feel Pirates of the Caribbean kind of boxed it in for a while, when there's a lot of stuff that we could do with the franchise. And that's where I kind of get into, like, I read this book and started to look up, because I was thinking about, I feel in media these days, for whatever reason, too many people are focusing on the end of these eras. And so I looked up the end of piracy, what happened and why, and thought, it'd be really cool if someone sort of created an alternate universe where the age of piracy just flourished and grew and changed the world in a certain way or something like that. I just came up with all these ideas and thoughts about like how many cool things we could explore with pirate fiction. A good example of that is One Piece, for example, over with our friends in the East. Is a very different type of pirate fiction, but I still feel robustly represents that. However, I'm not the biggest fan of One Piece. I find the amount of sheer content a little intimidating for one thing, and though I've tried to start it from the beginning and get through into it, it just really doesn't seem like it's for me. But it's if there's people out there who like it, that's fine, and it obviously has this big fan base, which is great. So that's just an example of the type of different stories we could be telling with pirates, and it's one of those things where I feel it is kind of an underserved genre at the moment. Um, Zach Taft says, I mean, some. Oh, okay. Zach Taft's bringing up all these questions about like superhero outfits and if they need to be revealing, and maybe I'll just write those down for like future ideas for streams or something like that, or videos, because that seems like a really complicated and a little off-topic question, and I think we'll leave it at that for now. But thanks for joining me, guys. I'll write those down at some point soon. But